Officially, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a great honor to be involved with the World Food Safety Day celebrations. World Food Safety Day takes place on the 7th of June, which is on Sunday, but it's not really possible for all of us to have a good time together on Sunday, what with us hopefully enjoying a weekend. And so with the help of the Department of Health, we decided to rather put together a whole week of celebrations in order to ensure that we make a proper celebration of this year's World Food Safety Day. I think you can agree that our minds have been very, very focused on the pandemic at hand. And it feels good to be able to talk about something other than coronavirus, even if it is just for a couple of hours. As we're all consumers, I think we all appreciate the fact that we have a right to safe and nutritious food. But although we have food safety controls in place, the WHO tells us that almost 1 in 10 people in the world fall ill after eating contaminated food. And this has a devastating effect on livelihoods. It has an impact on children being unable to learn and adults being unable to work. Although we have a very strong regulatory framework, it's not just the regulatory aspects that make sure that our food is safe. And we rely on public-private partnerships in order to do that. And really that's what today is all about, because I'm going to be discussing a number of public-private partnerships and how these work to keep you and I safe as South Africans. Where does World Food Safety Day come from? Well, on the 20th of December 2018, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution proclaiming a World Food Safety Day. And this is only the second time ever that we've actually had this day celebrated. And in terms of this year's World Food Safety Day, the theme is Food Safety, Everyone's Business. And the WHO has put out 5 calls to action in order to help us to understand what this actually means. And yesterday, we were fortunate enough to work with the Department of Health and the National Regulator for Compulsory Specifications, and we discussed the first call to action, which is ensuring it's safe. The second call to action is growing it safe. And this has really got to do with agriculture and food producers adopting good practices. And that's really the focus of what we're going to be talking about today. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our speakers. As you can see, I have a whole panel of them today, and a good number of them are vets. And so we're going to be talking a lot about animal health. And then we have a very, very special guest all the way from Melbourne in Australia. That's it. And he has stayed up very late in order to chat to us about produce safety. And so we're going to be talking all things green with Deon Mahoney a little bit later in this presentation. So thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Now, we've spent a lot of time so far talking about all things that have more than 2 legs and all the animal side of the agricultural sector. And now we're going to change our attention and we're going to look at all things green. And so I have a very special guest here who's joining us from Melbourne, Australia. And Deon is the head of food safety at PMA, and he's responsible for Australia and the New Zealand region. He's going to tell us a little bit about what PMA is all about, what they do in relation to agriculture and produce specifically. And then he's going to be talking to us a bit about some of the specific food safety issues. He's previously worked for the WHO and the FAO. He's also worked for Food Standards Australia and New Zealand. And worked in the dairy sector as a regulator. He's worked in 25 countries. You must have a thick passport, Deon. And he's got a wide range, published quite a bit on a whole lot of technical aspects. And I see he also has that big L word in his CV, Listeria monocytogeny. So I'm sure that he's got some great things to tell us about lettuce and whatnot. So Deon, I'm handing control over to you. You are now in control of the mouse. Hopefully we won't have too much of a lag. All yours.
Thank you very much, Linda. a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon. I want to talk about growing it safe from the perspective of horticulture and fresh produce, but I would firstly like to I thought I would just give a little bit of context, and Linda did lead in by talking about the 2018 UN resolution which adopted World Food Safety Day, and it's really interesting, if we can move to the next slide, to look at the content of that resolution, because it stresses the things that we really want to focus on when it comes to World Food Safety Day. That is food security. We cannot have food security without food safety. And that's particularly important in countries such as South Africa, countries in the developing world as well. Food security is a really critical issue, and you cannot have it without food safety. That food safety also contributes to trade, employment and poverty alleviation. There is a global burden of foodborne illnesses, and as you said at the outset, somewhere around 1 in 10 people in my country, Australia, it's between 1 in 4 and 1 in 6 people suffer an episode of foodborne illness every year. So that's a significant burden on a country, on its medical system. And it's also important for us to just raise awareness at all levels about promoting actions for global food safety. It impacts our domestic populations, it impacts our export markets if we don't get it right. If I move to the next slide, as my intro said, I've worked for the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations for a period of since the early 1990s, undertaking a range of assignments and consultations and being involved in expert panels. One of the things I wanted to stress here was that the global strategy for food safety, which I authored back in 2001, was a result of a resolution from the World Health Assembly in 2000 that food safety was a major public health issue. So it was the first time that the Assembly, which was dealing with things from HIV, tuberculosis, public health issues, recognised food safety as a significant public health issue. There's been a lot of activity ever since by both those UN agencies, World Health and FAO, in working to ensure food safety. You might notice the picture in the bottom right-hand corner. I was brought in by WHO to go and undertake work with the South African government and led the team that went to Polonium that isolated the outbreak strain from the premises there. So these are important bits of work that those two agencies do, and it's great that they recognise food safety through the designation of a designated day for World Food Safety. If we can move to the next slide, I'll give you some context to the organisation I work for, which is the Produce Marketing Association. It's a global entity. It is based in the United States, and we have agencies in Australia that look after Australia and New Zealand, and we have an agency in South Africa. It's a member-based organisation, so we have members. In South Africa, there are 103 members of PMA. They're buyers, they're sellers, they're everyone through the entire supply chain for fresh produce, horticulture products. And one of the challenges for us is to provide guidance about assuring the safety and the suitability of horticulture products, fresh produce for consumers globally. And I think it's important to stress here, we've talked about animals, we've talked about meat safety, we've talked about dairy safety. Horticulture is increasingly being seen as a significant cause of foodborne illness. When I studied microbiology, we were focused on meat, we were focused on seafood, we were focused on dairy products. And we've had histories of problems such as salmonella with milk powder in the 1970s. We had problems with listeria in the processed meat sector for many years. Largely those problems have been addressed, but we have increasing numbers of foodborne illness associated with horticulture products, be it lettuce, be it spinach leaves, be it cantaloupes or rock melons. These types of products are increasingly causing a burden of foodborne illness on people globally. And horticulture is a significant, no, if we just go back, horticulture is a significant industry in South Africa. It's a significant, that's okay. It's significant in terms of its annual gross value of production, which exceeds some 78 billion rand in figures from 2017, 2018, and accounts for a significant amount of employment in agriculture. But there are a wide range of products, and they're having different risk profiles. So if we take a root crop such as a carrot or a potato, the risks associated with those, the food safety risks of those types of products is incredibly small compared to, say, a rock melon or a strawberry or a berry or a fresh leafy green, because they have much different profiles. And one of the challenges are that these products don't have any kill step associated with them. We don't cook them, we don't treat them in a way that would remove pathogens. So if we go to the next slide, food safety, the critical ingredient. There's lots of things here that we need to focus on. We've got changing trends about the way we eat and how we eat. And there is a significant trend towards fresh produce, particularly because, and in these times of COVID-19, we're stressing to people the need for a healthy diet. We encourage people to eat nutritionally, and horticulture products provide a whole range of different benefits from a public health perspective, from a nutrition perspective, I should stress. And that's why we encourage people to eat these products. But there is also the risk, the increased risk of foodborne illness. Why? If we click on the next slide, we've got problems. Unlike the meat industry and the dairy industry, we don't have strong regulatory base. We don't have a strong historical base in terms of managing these products, because they weren't seen to be such a high risk in the past. Increasingly, we know that's the case, and now we're focusing on things such as inputs on the agricultural side. Water quality is really critical. The use of manure and fertilizers, proximities to animals and feedlots are all things which impact on our horticulture, on our fresh produce. Contaminated water, particularly, it's okay if you've got a root crop and you're watering at ground level, but if you're spraying contaminated water on a leaf crop, such as a lettuce, on a spinach product, you've got significant risks there for the consumer. We've got longer supply chains, and cold chain integrity becomes a real issue there for some of the pathogens that we're concerned about. There's no kill step for leafy greens. We're not going to give a cooking or a retorting or some sort of process on a leafy green. Fresh fruit, it's very difficult to clearly wash something like a strawberry or a rock melon. And we've got a lot of minimally processed products, a lot of pre-prepared salads. Again, there is great need for control over both the raw material and all of the steps in the processing chain, the cold chain. The other thing to take note of is in most countries, we've got increasing numbers of what we call yuppies, people that are very young, very old, are pregnant or immunocompromised. In my country, I estimate it's around 24% of the population of 25 million who could be classified in the yuppie group. And these people are vulnerable to things such as listeria, and more susceptible to infection. The types of hazards we encounter in fresh produce is not as significant. There's not as many as we find in say dairy products or in meat products, but the usual suspects. It's the salmonellas, it's the listerias, it's the enterohemorrhagic E. coli, Campylobacter. We also have a number of parasites which have been found to be transmitted by fresh produce, Cryptosporidium and Cyclospora. We're not going to dwell on it here, but there is also the issue of chemical residues and environmental contaminants which can impact on fresh produce. It's very difficult to get an idea of what the burden of illness is. I've not been able to identify any data from South Africa which gives us information about what the burden is, how many people are impacted by foodborne illness associated with fresh produce each year. But if we look at some of the costs associated with the outbreak of Listeriosis in Polonium in 2017-18, this is some work that was recently published in the Journal of Food Control. Their loss of life, they estimated, was somewhere between 264 million and 524 million. That's associated with daily adjusted life years. The loss of product, some 4,000 tonnes of product, valued at 55 million. These are US dollar figures. and export bans, which impacted on the ability to trade meat products into adjacent and other African countries, was estimated to cost $11 million. So aside from the public health impact of foodborne illness, there are significant commercial impacts as well. So the next steps, the horticulture industry is really now starting to take greater interest in managing food safety, because it's come to the fore. In Australia, we're just starting to look preliminary looks at introducing food standards for high-risk horticulture. These are products that are deemed to be higher risk, such as melons, berries, and leafy greens. But there needs to be a stronger focus. We need a better educated and resourced people in the primary industry sector to understand the risks. They need to understand they're part of a food supply chain, and that they need to address things such as inputs like water and manure and fertilizer, treated manures, treated fertilizers, or stabilized or composted products, to avoid the risk of transmitting enteric pathogens, etc., that might be in the manure. There needs to be enhanced oversight and control over those farm inputs. We need to think also about the management of insects and pests, because they do significantly impact the risk of contamination of these products. Some of the cases of contamination of EHEC in spinach in the United States were associated with wild boars that wandered through farm at night, something that was not envisaged as being a problem, but wild animals. There needs to be improvements in supply chain equipment and facilities to enable more effective sanitation of these products. Adherence to good hygienic practices, that's one of the areas that we're working on in Australia, along the entire food supply chain for fresh produce. Improvements in personal hygiene, improvements in hygienic practices. I think one of the spin-offs from what we're experiencing at the moment with COVID-19 is a greater emphasis on hand washing and hygiene. People are concerned not to become infected. The spin-off there is, the secondary impact is that we're going to have a safer food supply, because workers in food premises are adhering to these practices much more rigorously in the past. And finally, there's another part of this, and that's consumer education. Consumers need to understand that there is no such thing as a totally safe food, that there is risks inherent in everything, and they need to understand about proper handling and preparation of fresh produce. Again, there was an issue here with COVID-19, which I spoke about recently, which was about the fact that there was some very erroneous advice telling people to wash fresh produce in detergents and sanitizers. Completely wrong. Washing them in fresh running water is as good as it gets. That is an effective way of sanitizing. Not 100% perfect, but certainly not using sanitizers and detergents which are not appropriate and not recommended for products that you're going to eat. PMA is here to assist industry in that journey, and it's great that just last week Leanne Jones was appointed as the new country manager for South Africa. So I'm not sure if Leanne was on the line earlier on, but she'll be your contact in South Africa. Pleasure to talk today. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Deon. I was actually going to ask you the question about, so how do I wash that lettuce? Because I think it's a question on many people's lips. So if it's such a if it can make me sick, then how do I clean it properly? And the challenge always is, that you can't cook it, and there's not really a chemical that you can use at home. That is. So I'm glad that you mentioned that point.
One of the perceptions, and I think it's been highlighted more since with COVID-19, that in our supermarkets and in our shops, fruit and vegetables are there for people to touch and grab and sort through. Of course, we now look with aghast at someone if they're sorting through, touching avocados, and we think, oh, don't. Those products are not considered to be ready to eat. A very important definition in food safety is ready to eat, and that determines whether you have a Listeria standard or a Listeria absence of Listeria. These products are meant to be taken home and washed, And now, I don't think that's particularly well understood, and consumer education becomes an important issue here, that these products you do need to wash avocados. Surveys in the United States have shown that 17% of avocados in the United States, both domestic and imported avocados, had Listeria monocytogenes on the surface. They didn't find it in guacamole, but they found it on the surface. So we should be washing them, and washing them in cold running water is perfectly acceptable. That's perfectly fine, as long as that water is potable water. And that's the best we can possibly do. It obviously helps if a fruit and vegetable can be peeled, because you've then got an outer layer and a protection. But look at rock. Do you call them rock melons or cantaloupes?
We actually call them something else. We call them spun speck.
Oh, spun speck. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. If you, which I'm sure you haven't, but if you could ever look at a rock melon under an electron microscope, it looks like the Grand Canyon. There's an enormous number of nooks and crannies, and it's very difficult to wash and sanitize a rock melon. And we've had incidences in this country with salmonella and listeria associated with rock melon, and in the United States they've had listeria outbreaks. So just as you were having the problem with Polonium, we had problems with rock melons in Australia, and a different sequence type of listeria, but it was a significant problem in Australia. And it's changed the way now we handle rock melons and look at them, but there is a significant issue that if you're a vulnerable population, you should be well educated about the risks associated with rock melons.
Absolutely, yes. I think, your selection, if I had to offer you sushi or spinach, which one are you going to go with?
Oh, I go for sushi. I love sushi, but I'm very cautious. I wouldn't eat it on a Sunday or a Monday, because.
Oh, okay.
and I wouldn't. Prince Charles came to Australia and had raw fish in the centre in Alice Springs and got food poisoning. Alice Springs in Australia is thousands of miles from the coast, so you need to pick your place.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Deon. We really do appreciate your input. It's great to know that PMA is active in South Africa and is a resource for the South African produce industry, and we look forward to working with you again in the future. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.